Following the chaotic, blood-soaked landings of April 25, 1915, the grand strategic vision of a rapid, sweeping Allied conquest across the Gallipoli Peninsula had entirely evaporated, instantly replaced by a grim, suffocating reality. The soldiers of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps found themselves violently confined to an incredibly precarious, terrifyingly small sliver of rugged, inhospitable coastline. The Anzac perimeter was scarcely 2 miles long and, at its absolute deepest point, stretched less than 1,000 yards inland from the exposed beaches of the Aegean Sea. Ahead of them lay a completely impassable, labyrinthine network of steep sandstone ridges, deep, twisting gullies, and impenetrable, thorny coastal scrub, all utterly dominated by the deeply entrenched Ottoman forces holding the commanding heights. General Sir Ian Hamilton's desperate, frantic order to dig had violently birthed a sprawling, subterranean metropolis carved directly into the unforgiving, crumbling cliffs. Thousands of men, utilizing only basic, primitive entrenching tools, their heavy bayonets, and sheer, desperate physical exertion, transformed the sheer faces of Anzac Cove into a highly complex, terraced honeycomb of narrow trenches, precarious dugouts, and winding communication saps. This fragile, subterranean city was in a constant, agonizing state of construction and deadly repair, perpetually subjected to the relentless, terrifying rain of Ottoman artillery shells and highly accurate, deadly sniper fire that echoed ceaselessly through the narrow, twisting ravines. As the wet, freezing spring violently transitioned into the scorching, oppressive heat of the Mediterranean summer, the environmental conditions within this crowded, unventilated trench system deteriorated into an absolute, unimaginable nightmare. The sheer concentration of tens of thousands of unwashed men, thousands of pack animals, and the rapidly accumulating, unburied dead completely overwhelmed the primitive, highly inadequate sanitary arrangements of the expeditionary force. The heat within the narrow, windless gullies frequently soared to well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, completely baking the hard earth and transforming the deep trenches into suffocating, dust-choked ovens. This extreme, punishing heat, combined with the ubiquitous, horrific stench of decomposing flesh lying out in the heavily contested strips of no man's land, triggered an absolute biological catastrophe. Billions of massive, aggressive corpse flies, often described by the soldiers as being as large as bees, descended upon the Anzac positions in biblical, suffocating swarms. They coated every available surface in a shimmering, black carpet, thickly covered the men's meager, unappetizing rations of hardtack biscuits and salty bully beef the very second the metal tins were opened, and crawled relentlessly into the mouths, noses, and eyes of the exhausted, sleeping soldiers. Driven by these appalling, fundamentally unhygienic conditions, rampant, highly contagious waterborne diseases rapidly swept through the severely weakened ranks. Severe dysentery, paratyphoid, and crippling enteritis quickly became a far more terrifying and efficient killer than the Ottoman artillery batteries. Thousands of physically magnificent, deeply tanned young colonial men were rapidly reduced to emaciated, hollow-eyed skeletons, completely drained of their vitality and forced to suffer the profound indignity and excruciating physical pain of severe gastrointestinal illness while continually manning the front lines in a state of constant, paralyzing fear for their lives. The fundamental nature of the combat within this static, disease-ridden environment was incredibly intimate, exceptionally brutal, and profoundly psychological. Because the Anzacs were desperately clinging to the very edges of the precipitous cliffs, the physical distance between the opposing frontline trenches in several key, highly contested sectors was terrifyingly, almost absurdly short. At an absolutely vital strategic position known universally as Quinn's Post, a precarious foothold that prevented the entire Anzac line from being outflanked, the jagged, fortified sandbag lines of the Australians and the Turks were separated by a mere 15 yards of heavily cratered, blood-soaked earth. It was a suffocating, claustrophobic environment where men could clearly hear their enemies coughing, whispering, and mechanically preparing their weapons in the darkness. Here, the traditional infantry rifle was frequently abandoned entirely in favor of primitive, highly unpredictable, and devastatingly lethal improvised weapons. The opposing soldiers engaged in endless, terrifying duels using heavy, fuse-lit jam-tin bombs, desperately lobbing the crude explosives back and forth across the narrow, deadly void. The psychological toll of existing in this state of perpetual, immediate mortal danger was utterly immense. Every single movement, every careless raising of a head above the fragile, deteriorating sandbag parapets, invited instant, violent death from the highly skilled, fiercely dedicated Ottoman snipers who possessed an absolute, masterful understanding of the complex, broken terrain. The Anzacs lived like hunted, exhausted animals within the earth, their daily existence defined entirely by the agonizing scarcity of fresh drinking water, the relentless swarms of disease-carrying flies, and the perpetual prospect of a sudden, violent end in the suffocating dust. By the middle of May 1915, the High Command of the Ottoman Empire, deeply infuriated by the continued, stubborn presence of the Allied invaders upon their sovereign soil, firmly resolved to permanently and violently crush the Anzac beachhead. Enver Pasha, the ambitious, supremely confident, and highly aggressive Ottoman Minister of War, personally traveled to the Gallipoli front to meticulously oversee a massive, decisive, and overwhelming counteroffensive. The strategic objective was brutally simple and absolute: to concentrate overwhelming military force at the center of the line and physically push the exhausted, disease-ridden Anzac forces entirely off the cliffs and back into the depths of the Aegean Sea. To execute this grand, uncompromising vision, the Turks secretly amassed a staggering, heavily armed force of over 42,000 highly motivated infantrymen, commanded locally by the brilliant tactician Mustafa Kemal. They were positioned directly against a vastly inferior defending force of approximately 12,000 Anzacs desperately holding the fragile perimeter. Under the cover of profound, pitch-black darkness in the early, freezing hours of May 19, the massive Ottoman assault commenced. It was not a complex, highly nuanced tactical maneuver, but rather a terrifying, overwhelming wave of sheer human mass. Tens of thousands of Turkish soldiers simultaneously poured out of their covered assembly trenches and charged furiously across the narrow, heavily cratered expanse of no man's land, their bayonets fixed and their voices raised in fierce, terrifying religious battle cries, fully expecting to completely overrun the exhausted defenders through sheer, unstoppable physical momentum. However, the Anzac forces, though severely weakened by rampant dysentery, severe sleep deprivation, and profound physical exhaustion, were heavily entrenched, acutely alert, and completely prepared for the massive frontal assault. Utilizing their highly elevated, commanding defensive positions and a massive, concentrated, and highly coordinated array of heavy, water-cooled Vickers machine guns and rapid-fire Lee-Enfield rifles, they unleashed a devastating, utterly unbroken wall of lethal lead directly into the charging Ottoman ranks. The result was not a traditional battle, but a localized, horrific display of modernized industrial slaughter. The narrow strips of open ground between the opposing trenches rapidly became a terrifying, impassable abattoir. Wave after courageous wave of Turkish infantrymen were ruthlessly and systematically mown down in the darkness, their bodies violently piling up in thick, gruesome, overlapping mounds directly in front of the Anzac sandbag parapets. The intense, deafening, mechanical roar of the heavy machine guns continued completely unabated until the pale, grey light of dawn finally illuminated the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of the carnage. The Ottoman grand offensive had failed absolutely and disastrously. In a matter of mere, bloody hours, the attacking forces had suffered a staggering, incomprehensible 10,000 casualties, including well over 3,000 dead, while the deeply entrenched and highly disciplined Anzacs had lost roughly 160 men. The terrifying, unprecedented volume of dead bodies violently scattered across the narrow, sun-baked earth of no man's land immediately created a profound, completely unmanageable biological crisis that fundamentally transcended the intense, hateful animosity of the ongoing war. As the scorching Mediterranean sun relentlessly baked the exposed, pulverized battlefield over the following days, the horrific, sweet and sour stench of thousands of rapidly decomposing bodies became entirely unbearable for the soldiers on both sides of the line. The massive, dark swarms of aggressive corpse flies multiplied exponentially, completely covering the dead, and the terrifying, very real threat of a catastrophic, unstoppable cholera or typhus epidemic threatened to completely wipe out both opposing armies far more effectively than any artillery barrage. Driven by sheer, desperate biological necessity and a profound, shared sense of horrific mutual suffering, a highly extraordinary and deeply moving event occurred. On May 24, 1915, a formal, heavily negotiated 9-hour armistice was officially declared across the entire Anzac sector. The relentless, deafening roar of the artillery and the sharp crack of sniper fire abruptly ceased, entirely replaced by a surreal, deeply unsettling, and absolute silence. Men from both sides cautiously climbed entirely out of their deep, protective trenches and walked unarmed into the horrific, blood-soaked center of no man's land to solemnly bury their rotting dead in massive, shallow mass graves. Amidst this grim, horrifying, and deeply traumatizing labor, a profound, enduring mutual respect was unexpectedly forged in the dust. The Anzacs and the Turks, who had been viciously slaughtering each other for weeks without mercy, began to communicate through basic gestures, exchanging highly prized items like salty bully beef and hardtack for rich Turkish tobacco and handmade cigarette papers. They saw each other not as faceless, evil monsters of imperial propaganda, but as fellow, exhausted human beings equally caught in a terrifying, industrial meat grinder. When the armistice tragically concluded and the men solemnly returned to their respective trenches to resume the mechanized slaughter, the profound psychological dynamic of the entire campaign had permanently shifted, birthing the highly respectful and deeply enduring moniker Johnny Turk. By the intense, suffocating summer month of August 1915, the overarching strategic situation on the Gallipoli Peninsula had completely stagnated into a deeply frustrating, incredibly costly, and seemingly unbreakable deadlock. General Sir Ian Hamilton, the increasingly desperate Allied Supreme Commander, fully recognized that the entire, massively expensive Dardanelles campaign was teetering perilously on the very brink of catastrophic, humiliating political and military failure. In a final, incredibly ambitious, and heavily convoluted strategic gamble to decisively break the suffocating trench stalemate and secure the elusive, overarching victory, he orchestrated a massive, multi-pronged operation officially known as the August Offensive. The highly complex plan involved secretly landing a massive, fresh force of British troops further north at the sprawling, Salt Lake Plain of Suvla Bay to outflank the enemy. Simultaneously, the Anzac forces were commanded to violently break out of their confined, claustrophobic coastal perimeter, launching a series of desperate, highly coordinated infantry assaults designed to capture the towering, dominant peaks of the Sari Bair Range, specifically the vital heights of Chunuk Bair. If these towering peaks could be finally secured, the Allied artillery could effectively dominate the entire peninsula, completely cutting off the vital Ottoman supply lines and theoretically forcing a rapid, decisive victory. However, to successfully draw the fierce, highly mobile Ottoman reserves away from the primary, critical thrust towards the high peaks, the Anzacs were rigidly ordered to launch a series of incredibly bloody, highly visible diversionary attacks against some of the most heavily fortified, seemingly impregnable Turkish positions on the entire battlefront. The most intensely brutal, terrifying, and ultimately legendary of these diversionary assaults occurred at a heavily fortified, elevated plateau deeply covered by a solitary, surviving tree, known ominously to the troops as Lone Pine. At exactly 5:30 p.m. on August 6, the men of the Australian 1st Brigade charged furiously out of their concealed tunnels and across the narrow expanse of no man's land, fully expecting to drop directly into open enemy trenches and engage in traditional combat. Instead, they were met with a terrifying, entirely unexpected architectural and tactical obstacle. The highly ingenious Ottoman defenders had completely roofed their deep, complex frontline trench system with massive, thick pine logs heavily covered in packed earth to protect themselves from devastating shrapnel bursts. The charging Australian infantrymen were forced to frantically, desperately tear at the heavy, unyielding logs with their bare, bleeding hands and primitive metal entrenching tools while completely exposed to highly accurate, withering enemy machine gun fire from the flanks. When they finally managed to violently breach the heavy wooden roofs, they plunged blindly into the pitch-black, suffocating subterranean tunnels below. What immediately ensued was 4 agonizing days of the most intense, savage, and deeply horrific close-quarters hand-to-hand combat of the entire First World War. Men fought desperately in complete, terrifying darkness using heavy bayonets, improvised wooden clubs, fists, and point-blank bomb blasts within a claustrophobic, blood-slicked maze entirely choked with the bodies of the dead and dying. The Australians miraculously managed to capture and desperately hold the position against furious, unrelenting Turkish counterattacks, a localized, horrific victory that came at the staggering cost of over 2,000 casualties and resulted in the extraordinary awarding of 7 Victoria Crosses for supreme, unimaginable valor. Yet, the agonizing, bloody triumph at Lone Pine was immediately and entirely overshadowed by an absolute, catastrophic tragedy that occurred the very next morning at a narrow, heavily fortified ridge known simply as the Neck. The objective was to launch a rapid, decisive bayonet charge across a piece of ground no wider than 3 tennis courts to overwhelm a highly concentrated network of deeply entrenched Ottoman machine guns holding the vital high ground. The attack was supposed to be immediately preceded by a massive, devastating naval artillery bombardment to completely destroy the enemy defensive positions and force the defenders underground. However, due to a fatal, completely unforgivable failure in synchronizing pocket watches between the offshore naval commanders and the frontline infantry officers, the protective artillery barrage ceased a full 7 minutes before the infantry attack was scheduled to commence. This fatal, agonizing delay allowed the highly disciplined Turkish defenders to fully emerge from their deep, protective subterranean shelters and completely man their heavy water-cooled machine guns, heavily pre-sighting them directly upon the narrow, exposed strip of open ground. Knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty that they were running directly into an entirely unbroken wall of lethal lead, the incredibly brave, dismounted troopers of the Australian Light Horse Regiment rigidly followed their strict military orders. Wave after wave of young, physically magnificent men vaulted bravely over the sandbags and charged furiously into the narrow killing zone. They were ruthlessly, systematically mown down within mere seconds, their bodies violently collapsing in thick, overlapping lines upon the dusty earth. Out of the 600 brave men who leapt from the protective trenches at the neck, nearly 400 were instantly killed or severely wounded in a display of absolute, senseless slaughter. The catastrophic failure fundamentally broke the spirit of the invasion, proving with grim certainty that the campaign was hopelessly doomed.